Hi there, and welcome back to part 3 of this tutorial series about creating the classic game Pong in Unity, with a few nice additions. If you haven't checked out parts 1 and 2 so far, I highly recommend you to do so, as this is a direct continuation of these. If you want to get in at this moment though, there's a link to the GitHub repository in the description, and I set up some tags so you can check out exactly the repository state after each video. So far we have set up the basic Pong game logic in part 1, and in part 2 we made some improvements like making the ball faster on each hit and improving physics. Today we'll have a closer look at some more UI topics and the Unity animation system and the game flow. So we'll animate this score UI a little bit each time a player gets a point. We'll add a very simple controls tutorial, pretty much just the text, to tell the players how to play the game. Then we'll add a start button, and only when this one is pressed the game actually begins. And we'll add a little win screen to tell which player has won. And yeah, at the end we're also going to do a little cleanup again. Since last time I upgraded the Unity version again to the latest LTS version, .28, and the same thing happened again that I told you about at the beginning of the last video. Everything turned red inside Visual Studio. And last time we had the solution to right click anywhere and re-import all, but there is a better solution for this. So close Visual Studio first and then right click, and you can do this anywhere, by the way. You can show in Explorer. This opens an Explorer window at exactly the point in the hierarchy where you clicked, and then delete these two files, or maybe you might have even more, all CS project and solution files. Delete them, go back into Unity and start Visual Studio again, and it's going to rebuild the solution. We're just going to wait 1 second for this, and there we go. Everything looks great again. This solution I think is better than using re-import all, because re-import all, like it says on the label, it re-imports all of your assets, including all your graphical assets and audio and stuff. And these might get big, and there might be a lot of them, and it might take forever to do re-import all. Whereas this solution now only affects the scripts and is much faster. One last thing before we get started. First, let me make the text a little bigger. I changed my Visual Studio layout a little bit since last time. Previously it was like this, but if you have a lot of scripts, that's not the case for this project, but in my other projects I experienced this. The space up here can get quite crowded, and we can change this tab layout so that we have the tabs on the right. I also closed this Solution Explorer that was here previously because I pretty much never use it. But this is all up to you. Just try out a few different things and see what works best for you. Alright, let's get going. Let's animate this score UI. And for this we're going to create a new folder called Animations. And we could create a subfolder for the score UI here, but since this is the only thing we are going to animate for now, we'll leave it at that. And we're going to use Unity's animation system and Unity's state machine system. So this animator controller is a state machine where we can switch between different animations. And we're just going to call this score UI controller. And now we gotta assign it somewhere, and we have our score text here, and we can add a new component called Animator. And yeah, this is the component needed to use this asset, and we're just gonna drag it in here. Next, let's create an actual animation, and for this right click animation, and we're gonna call this score UI idle. And yeah, this asset, this animation asset, is for the actual animation of the object, and this controller controls which animation is played at the moment. And we got this little box right here that says loop time. This means this animation gets repeated. Now let's animate our score text, and yeah, we're gonna open the prefab for this and open the animation window. If you don't see this one, it's under Window, Animation, and then animation, and there's also the animator window. You can also just double click on this one and then animate this. Yeah, but back on the score text, we don't see the animation here. That is because we haven't assigned it in the controller. So if we open the controller in the animator window and drag in this score UI idle and go back to our score text and to the animation window, now we see it appear up here. Let's add some properties to our animation by using this button, and we see a list of the components. And what do we want to animate? I think we want to animate the scale right here, and you have to click this little plus to add it to the list of animated properties. So the scale to make the number bob a little bit. And we also want to animate the font color, and be careful, it's not this one for Text Mesh Pro, it's this one, font color. And now, since our idle animation, you can do this however you want. You can animate your idle animation, but I'm just going to use it as the default state and not animate it at all. And I'm going to remove this keyframe right back here, and it's just going to be the default. Let's get to the good stuff now and create the highlight animation. For this, let's duplicate Shift D, the idle animation, and just call it highlight instead. When duplicating this animation, it has the same properties that the previous one had already assigned, which is very helpful in our case. Now we also have to assign this one in the controller for it to show up. And now we can go to our highlight animation and start animating. So let's zoom out a bit at first using the mouse wheel. So this timeline up here, it might be a bit confusing. So at 1, it's at 1 second. And for example, at 30, it's at half a second. At 20, it's at the third of a second. And I think we're going to go with a third of a second here. And right click here and add key. So a key or keyframe is a point in time where you determine what the animation properties, what the value is of the animation property. And in between, Unity is going to interpolate between these. So let's give Unity something to interpolate. Move to the middle of the animation and let's just type in 1.33. And now we see Unity automatically creates these keyframes for us. By the way, there's another way to enter this. You can go into record mode, and then everything you do in the inspector will be keyframed. So if we enter the Y value here, you see it's getting keyframed here. But don't forget to exit this recording mode again, or else you might screw up something. Now let's hit play and see our animation, and we see that nothing is animated. Why is that? Well, that's because we're in prefab mode, and down here we have the game view, which is concerned with the instantiated objects in the game. So in prefab mode, we can actually see the changes if we use the scene view. So let's just focus on this again. And if we now hit play, we can see the animation in the prefab mode. But there's another way to do this, and we can just exit prefab mode. This really doesn't matter if we're in prefab mode or right here in the hierarchy, because these animations are assets and they're independent of the hierarchy. So now we're in the hierarchy and back in the normal scene view mode. And if we now change the animation of one of the score text and let it play, we can, oh no, this is the idle animation. Okay, we have to select the highlight animation, of course, and now we can see it animating in the game view. Let's also add a color to our animation, and for this, the record mode is great because we can see it directly in the inspector. And let's go with something greenish, maybe not too bright, maybe something like this. Yeah. And exit record mode again and just see how the animation plays. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Now we want to trigger the animation somehow, and for this we gotta wire this up inside the animator window. I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger maybe. So The animator window. It has a list of layers. We're not gonna get into this. This is more advanced stuff and we're not needing it right now. And it has a list of parameters. And we can add a trigger parameter. This is a parameter that is set once and then fires. And we're gonna call it highlight. And now we can make transitions between these animations. And for this, we'll right click on one of the animations and choose make transition. Okay, we have one transition up here and we also want to transition back. So now the transition, when should it occur? This one transition up to the highlight stage should occur when we set the trigger. And for this, we're gonna add a condition. And since we only have one trigger, it's gonna automatically fill this with our trigger. Otherwise, if you have multiple triggers or bools, or you can also use float values, then you can choose them right here. So now this transition occurs when we go up. But there are more settings for these transitions, and we're gonna have a look at this. This one has exit time. It means that the transition only occurs after this animation has played for so and so much percent. So this is 75%. And we want it to play immediately, so we can set this to 0 or just uncheck has exit time. And this transition duration, we'll also set this to 0 for this one. It means an interpolation between the two animations. So we'll set this to 0. And then now for our transition back, we want this one to play in full. So it's gonna have an exit time. It doesn't need a trigger. It just should play in full. So we'll set this one to 1 and also the transition duration to 0. We don't need interpolation between these. Just a little food for thought now. We could have also set this up in a different way. You see these transitions, they interpolate between two animations. And we have our highlight animation. It's a full animation, but we could have also, like our idle animation, set this to just one keyframe, this one in the middle right here, and then we go into the animator window and we could play around with the transition durations and exit times to achieve a similar effect. I encourage you to maybe try this out and see what works best for you. Now we have everything set up and just have to trigger it from our scripts. And for this, let's go into the score text script and add this code. So we get a reference to our animator component. And then we have a method called highlight where we set this trigger that we configured before that triggers the transition to the highlighted state. Be careful with typos here, because this has to be exactly the same as you configured it in the animator. Now, jumping back into Unity, we can go into prefab mode and, oh, I forgot to save this. 1 second just, and back into Unity. We now have this animator and this annoying little Unity bug. Just click it away. And since we have the animator right here on this object, we can just drag this object in and have the animator reference right there. Now, where do we call this? Of course, in our game manager, in our onScoreZoneReached method. This is exactly when the highlight should appear. And for this, we're gonna add a new tiny method called highlightScore, and we're gonna give it the player ID. And if the player ID is 1, then it's gonna highlight the left score text, and else, if it is 2, then it's gonna highlight the right score text. And we just have to call it in onScoreZoneReached. So let's call highlightScore and give it the ID. Yeah, and let's jump back into Unity and see if this actually works. Let's hit play and yeah. All right, this animation is working. Is it working for the other player as well? Yes. All right. I think that's the animation of the score UI all done. Let's tick it off the list. Next up is the controls tutorial, and for this we're first gonna focus on the canvas by double-clicking it, and then we're gonna create a new empty call it menu. This is going to be the holder for our in-game menu later on, where also the start button will reside. And we only want the tutorial text to be visible when this menu is open. And we'll have a little background for this menu, so let's stretch it all across the canvas. And to do this, hold down the Alt key. This means also set position, and click this one in the bottom right. And now it's stretched all across. And with this we can easily create a background, UI image. Let's call this one background. And we will also stretch this all across. Alt click in the bottom right. And yeah, this now we can't see our game anymore. So let's make this black, and let's decrease the alpha a little bit, maybe to 100. I want to have 128 here for obvious reasons. And okay, so now we can actually distinguish between our menu being open and closed, which is going to be the gameplay. Next, let's create a holder for our tutorials, call it tutorials, and we want this to be anchored at the bottom of the screen. So we go here and stretched all across the width. So we go here and Alt click this one here. So now it's at the bottom, but we see it still has a position of 50. That's because the Y pivot is at the center. So if we increase the height, just to show you real quick, it's going to extend beyond the borders of the canvas, which is something we do not want. We want to set the pivot to 0, which means at the bottom. And we can do this by just entering the value here or shift clicking this one. And it's going to set this one to 0. And now if we increase the height, it's only increasing upwards. So yeah, you see this whole UI thing is a big topic in and of itself, and I'm only scratching the surface here, but just want to give you a little bit of inputs beyond what we actually need. So now we're ready to create our tutorial texts, UI text, text mesh pro, and call this tutorial left. And we are going to shift click this one to anchor it at the left side. So now we can enter an X position, and we can change it to something at a distance from the left side, which is great. I think I'm gonna go with 80 here. And now it's a little bit too much at the bottom. We can easily fix this by adjusting the height here. So now it's in a good spot, I think. And we'll finally enter the text. So yeah, let's get into this text first. So usually you adjust the font style down here, but there is also some markup you can use to adjust it right within the text. So we could have two texts, one that is bold and one that is not bold, or we can do it like this and make a part of the text just bold by using this one here. It's similar to HTML. And right, so now we have the problem that it's not wide enough. So let's increase the width to something like, oh no, not 4,000, 400. Okay, so this one looks pretty good. Let's duplicate this for the right one. And this one, again, we want to pivot it at the right, shift click this one. And for the same distance, we're going to go with -80 here. And the only thing we're going to do now for the position is to change the alignment. So now it looks a bit stupid. Now it looks pretty cool. So this is player 2, and they are going to move with the arrows. So yeah, I think this looks pretty good. And yeah, we can tick it off the list, the controls tutorial. Next up is the start button. So let's create it. Right click on the menu and UI button text mesh pro, and call this one start button. And once again, the difference between these text mesh pro components and these vanilla components is that the text mesh pro text renders much more crisp and less blurry. So this start button is really small, so let's make it bigger, and maybe 120, yeah, that looks good. And let's give it a text, start game. And this is also very small, so let's make it bigger and bold. Yeah, looks good. So far we got all our UI related code inside the game manager, but since we're adding to it and there's more to come in the future, let's create an extra script for this and call this one game UI. And we'll assign it to the canvas, I think. I think that's the best way to go about it. And in the game manager, so we have access to it, let's create a reference to it. So public game UI, and let's call it game UI. And back in Unity, we will assign this reference. Let's do a bit of cleanup and move our existing UI code from the game manager to the new game UI class, because this is the one that should handle this. So let's get rid of these, we don't need them. And what is UI in here? The score texts are definitely UI, so let's move them over. And then we get some red in here because we removed these variables, but we are also gonna move these two methods over because they concern the UI. And now one thing I want to do is rename these variables, because score text left, maybe let's just call it score text player 1 and score text player 2, because then it's easier to say score player 1 belongs to score text player 1 and so on. And now we see this one here turns red, so we're gonna pass these in as parameters. So score player 1 and score player 2. This has to be an integer, of course. And back to the game manager, we can now say we want to call these methods on the game UI reference. So we have update scores and highlight score. And update scores is still red because it expects these two parameters. So score player 1 and score player 2 will pass this in, and it is still red. Why is that? Because this one is private. Okay, let's make it public. Back inside Unity, we now have to assign these score text references again. So score text left and score text right, let's assign them to the game UI component. And let's just, to be consistent, let's just call this one score text player 1 and this one score text player 2. Now we want to do something whenever this start button is pressed, and for this we're going to go back into our game UI script and add a method that handles that button press. And we also have a reference to our menu object. If you remember, this is this one that holds the complete menu, and yeah, we have to create this reference as a game object is fine in this case because we only want to switch it on and off. So now we have this game object, and back inside Unity we can assign it. And now to wire up that button, we go down. I'm not sure if you can see this because my video is in front. I'm gonna do it like this, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so we have this on-click event, and we can add an action to this, and then we're gonna drag in our canvas object where our game UI component is on, and then we're gonna call something. And here we can choose between all the different components on the object, but we want the game UI script, and we want to call the on start game button clicked. And now let's see if this works. So the expected outcome is if we start the press the start game button, then the menu is going to disappear, and it does. And once again, this is not a reference exception, Unity bug. So now we want the ball to not immediately start moving when we enter play mode, but only after we press the start game button. So for this, we're going to go into our ball script and just remove this initial push call. And yeah, back in Unity, we now see that the ball doesn't move at all, but also it doesn't move when we start the game because we still have to tell it. For this, we can once again make use of events, and let's go back into the game UI script and add an action. And once again, we gotta have it from the system namespace, and on start button clicked, we are going to invoke it if it is not null. If you remember this little question mark as if it is null or not. Now all that's left to do is to make the ball listen to this event. And for this we're going to go back to the ball script and add another event listener, and this time not on the game manager instance but on the game UI, since this is the one firing the event. And on start game we just reset the ball. And we're going to save this and head back into Unity and see if it works. So the game has started, and let's go. And when we press start game, it starts the game. Perfect. Now we can still move our pedals before we even started the game, but I think that's pretty much fine as it doesn't really matter and it's kind of fun actually. If you wanted to, you could, in a similar way to the ball, subscribe to this on-game started event in the pedal script and, for example, set a Boolean value once the event is fired, and only then, if this Boolean value is true, you can call this move function in the update method. But that's totally up to you. Just try it out if you like to. So that's our start button all done, but one more little PS before we move on. You might have wondered about this object called event system. This was created when we created the canvas, and I haven't talked about this earlier because it didn't matter so much, but this event system is there to handle input to the UI components. And if we remove it, then we cannot press the start game button anymore. And by the way too, if you remove stuff in play mode from the hierarchy, then it's just gonna appear again when you go out of play mode. This is only for the scene hierarchy though. If you are in play mode and do stuff in the project view, these changes will persist. Next up is our win screen, and for this we first gotta set a win condition, and yeah, I think it should be once a certain score has been reached, right? What else are we gonna use? So we're gonna create a new integer and call it max score, and maybe set it to 4. I think 4 is good. We can always adjust these values later. And inside the game manager, let's create a new method and call this check win. And this syntax, this might seem familiar to you. If we go back to the ball, this is the ternary operator. If you remember this, it reads if this before the question mark is true, then do this, and after the dots, this is the else. But we can also chain this together. So we want to know which player has won the game, which player has reached the max score. So we go, if the score of player 1 equals the max score, then we say the winner ID is 1. Else, we're going to do another check and see if the score of player 2 is the max score. If so, we set the winner ID to 2. And otherwise, we're going to set it to 0, which means no one has reached the max score yet. Yeah, and if someone has reached the max score, aka winner ID unequals 0, then we have a winner and can do something. And what do we want to do once one player has won? We want to display a text that shows which player has won, and we also want to show the menu again and the tutorials again and the start button again, so we can start another game right afterwards if we wanted to. So let's go into, this is all UI stuff, right? So let's go into our game UI and let's create a new method called onGameEnds and give it the winner ID. And in this method, we are gonna just set the menu object back to active and set a text for the winner. We're gonna create this one in a second. The sun has come out a bit, so I'm entering full holy mode now. Be prepared. But first of all, let's check out this syntax. Maybe you haven't seen it like this before. Maybe you have more seen it like this, or maybe not at all if you're just starting out. So strings. We can put strings together. This is called concatenation. And we can do it like this. Like this is a text that we define, and we can put a variable in between and then a text at the end and attach as much as we want. Or we can use this $sign in front of the screen, and then we can ditch these plus signs. And I like this one more because it seems cleaner to me, and we can just use these variables in curly brackets. So we will go with that one, and this one will gonna read out player 1 wins or player 2 wins, depending on which one is gonna be passed in. Now we still have to create a reference for this text object, and yeah, we do it up here, and we're not using the TM-Pro namespace yet, so let's do it. So now nothing is read anymore, and we can save and back into the game manager. This is something I forgot earlier. We still, of course, have to call this check win method, and yeah, call the onGameEnds method on the game UI. So onGameEnds, and we're gonna pass it the winner ID. So now you might be asking, and rightfully so, why are we not using an event here like we did for on start game and on reset? Well, we could use an event, that would be possible, but we already have a direct reference to the game UI in here. So I thought, let's just use it straight away. And yeah, only the game UI needs to know about this game end event so far. Like maybe we're gonna run later into other objects that need to know about this, and then we're gonna change this maybe to an event. But for now, this is sufficient. Back in Unity, let's create our win text. And for this, you noticed by now, we're gonna create a new text mesh pro text and call this one win text. And let's enter a text in here so we can see it. We're gonna move it quite a bit up from the center. And yeah, I think we're gonna stretch it all across the length, and then we're gonna center the text also. And now, okay, now I have to move it up again. Okay, maybe at 256, yes, nice, and the size of 128. And do we make this bold? Yes, of course we make this bold. So this is how it's gonna look, and I think it looks good. Now we gotta assign this, and we're doing that right here. Now, of course, this text shouldn't say player wins right when we start the game, so we could just delete it, but we can also just use it as our title. So let's type in Pong, maybe in caps lock. So this is now our title win text, and yeah, maybe to be a bit fancy and say that we make a very custom version of Pong, let's call it Pong with a not capital P. So this is our version of Pong, and now let's check it out. So let's test this real quick. We are not quite done yet, almost, but there are still 2 things more to do, and we're gonna check this out and also see if everything else works. So we're gonna get one player to 4 points and see if the win screen triggers, and it does, but the game just goes on in the background, which could be fine, but I think now if player 2 gets, now player 2 suddenly wins. So this is something we do not want. And also what we want is when we restart the game and press the start game button again, then we want the scores to reset. So these 2 things we're gonna do now. So the ball is always reset when it enters a score zone. We can check this right here. If we do find all references, and on the onReset, which is always called when a score zone is reached, we see that the ball subscribes to this and always calls its reset ball method, which gives it its initial push. The reset itself wouldn't be too bad, but this initial push is the thing that pushes it forward. And so this is always called in any case the score zone is reached. But we're gonna remove this from here, and we only want to call this when a score zone is reached and no winner is found. So we're gonna move this into the check win method. So now, if we find a winner and open the win screen, then the ball is not reset and pushed. But otherwise, in every other case, when the score ticks on normally, then we're gonna have the same behavior as before. Now, the only thing left for us to do is to reset the scores whenever the game is restarted or started. Like it starts at 0, but we can also call this when the game is started for the first time. It doesn't matter. It's called whenever we press the on start game button. And we already got an event for this, so let's subscribe to this. And in the game manager, we keep track of the scores. So this is where we reset the scores. And let's first create a method for this. So on start game, we set the scores back to 0, and then we gotta tell the game UI to update the scores display. And now all that's left to do is to go to game UI, and on the on start game event, we're gonna add our on start game method. And that's it. So let's see if everything works as we expected. Let's start the game, and yeah, we gain some score, and okay, let's get 1 player to 4, player 2, and player 2 wins. The ball is not reset and pushed. In fact, it's flying around the level like it's going somewhere, but we don't have to care. It's all right. We could reset its position, but this is fine. This is good enough, and good enough is often better than perfect. So yeah, and what else did we want? Yeah, we wanted to see if we can reset the scores. So let's click start game, and the scores are back to 0. Perfect. So yeah, this is, I think, the win screen all done. So now we got this point, clean up event subscriptions left, but I think I'm gonna move this down the line a bit, but just show you real quickly what I mean in case you run into any of this stuff. So if we subscribe to an event, the thing is, we also should unsubscribe at the end of an object's lifetime. Otherwise, this stuff can linger somewhere in memory and cause weird behavior and stuff. So usually what we do is in the onDestroy method, which is called whenever a game object is destroyed, which is, for example, if we change a scene or if we exit play mode. And then we use this syntax minus equals, and this means we unsubscribe from the event. For our little game here, which only has 1 scene and no scene reloading, this is all fine. It works without this, but just if you run into this with your own other projects, I just wanted to let you know. And the reason we're not doing this right now, but push it further down the line, is that I'm getting a bit unhappy with our events. Like, we have a lot of cross references. You see, we have from the game manager, which is a singleton, we have a reference to the game UI, and then the game UI raises an event, and the game manager listens to this event. And in the method that is called, when the game manager listens to this event, it again tells the game UI to do something. And this is very cross-referencey and doesn't feel good to me. And I think maybe down the line, I'm not sure yet, I can't promise you if we'll get to that, but I'm thinking about like writing something like an event manager and changing this a bit. But first of all, we're gonna do the rest of the list. So I already moved it down the line and added the possibility of making an event manager. And with that, we're all done for today. And in the next one, we're gonna do some audio stuff, music and sound. It's gonna be great fun. I can promise you that the next 2 videos are gonna be great fun. Like audio and effects, this is always the most fun to me, and I think to a lot of other game devs when developing games. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any feedback or questions or whatever comes to your mind, let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.